The media inquiry and the convergence review is still some weeks away, but it seems likely that whatever the government comes up with, the coalition will oppose. Tony Abbott, the opposition leader, gave an address today in defence of free speech, accusing the government of state-sponsored bullying and warning any new media watchdog could become a political correctness enforcement agency. Joining me to discuss the day, Labor MP Nick Champion and Liberal Senator Gary Humphries. We'll go first to hear from Tony Abbott on what he won't accept from the media inquiries.
The coalition rejects the Finkelstein proposals and calls on the government to do likewise. The coalition opposes any coercion towards greater self-regulation and calls on the government to repudiate it. The coalition rejects calls for the introduction of a public interest test or any other suitability test for those with a stake in our media and calls on the government to do likewise. Australia does not need more regulation of the mainstream media, but we do need a new debate about freedom of speech because it's important for the current government to reveal its true colours.
Nick, Mr Abbott told his audience that the more powerful people are, the more important the presumption must be that the less powerful people should be able to say exactly what they think of them. Is there anything wrong with that principle?
Well, look, this has always been a country where I think people have been free to express their displeasure about politicians and other powerful figures. It's part of the Australian character. Has been since, the Anzac days and will be well into our future. But I think what Tony Abbott's exhibited today is the fact that he is a paranoid, right-wing loudmouth with a persecution complex. I mean, he's invented this sort of mythical world where he's put upon and persecuted, and there's some political correct police out there trying to tell him and his other conservative cronies what they can say or do, or
isn't it though
what they can say and what they can't say. I mean, it's a nonsense, Linda.
Isn't it though, Nick, the other
nonsense.
way around, that Tony Abbott was saying the government's agenda is being driven because it's fearful, it doesn't accept the criticism that some of the media have been levelling at it?
Well, we've taken more criticism than any other government, I think, in the history of the nation, thanks to 24-hour news cycles, and we've accepted it in the main with good graces. I just think what we saw today was just an exercise in politicking and pandering to a right-wing base that wants to pretend that it's persecuted and put upon, while it goes around the country very loudly putting its case and very aggressively putting its case. So, I find the whole thing to be a bit of a, Tony Abbott's position to be a bit of a joke, to be honest.
Gary, can you promise that a coalition government will cop criticism, while accepting, as Mr Abbott says, the price of free speech is that offence will be given, facts will be misrepresented and lies will be told?
Well, of course I'm happy to accept that that's the price you pay for freedom of speech. I don't like what Nick just said about Tony Abbott, but I'm very glad I live in a country where he can say it freely. And the fact of life is that right at the moment this issue is topical because the government is talking about compromising, winding back that freedom to talk about other politicians and political parties in that way.
But previous coalition governments have responded to criticism. For example, Richard Alston didn't like ABC reporting of the Iraq War. He took, I think it was 68 complaints to the Broadcasting Authority. He floated the idea of setting up an independent complaints process for the ABC. So governments of both stripes don't always respond with a completely blasé attitude to criticism, do they?
Well, that's absolutely right, but there's a difference between getting hot under the collar because you're criticised and actually taking a step to compromise our traditions of freedom of the press and free speech in this country. And this is what, unfortunately, we're talking about today, because the government has a report on its table which suggests that there might be a beefed-up news council which has the ability to look over what is being said, to suggest that some organisations should retract what they say or should amend what they say on the basis of them not meeting some standard which is underpinned by this new government-sponsored body. That's a very significant development in an age when Australia is looking at pressure on the media, and there's a lot of diversity in the media, and yet The government is now talking about changing the rules at a time where it's copying a lot of criticism. That's a very real concern which I think the government needs to respond to by ruling out the recommendations of the Finkelstein inquiry.
Nick, can a system be designed that deals purely with criticism on an objective basis, and is there a danger if it gets into a subjective judgment of what the media do?
Well, look, I mean, I find it interesting that we're having this very knee-jerk response from the Liberal Party about this. I mean, what we have is a couple of reports. The government will respond in due course. The community will have a debate on it. We live in a free country. And I would have thought that it's highly unlikely that there's going to be any, winding back of critical examination of government actions. And this sort of paranoid persecution complex that the Liberal Party and conservative forces around the world have is just, it really is laughable. And whenever they try and peddle it out, I'm just amazed that we spend time debating it. They went after the ABC with an axe, when they were in government. They go after anybody who criticises them very, very aggressively indeed, and yet when anybody tries to apply any standards to them at all, they get hypersensitive about it. I just think this is an example of the Conservatives around this country having of being bullies with glass jaws, and I don't think it really should be entertained by the general public.
Gary, just one final quick question on this. Should the Coalition be ruling out so much when you don't yet know what the government's response will be to either the Finkelstein inquiry or to the Convergence Review?
It's perfectly appropriate for the Coalition to rule out compromising free speech. What the government has on the table is a report it commissioned which suggests that free speech should be compromised in the interest of protecting governments from being criticised. That we can rule out, and we will rule out, and we do rule out today, as Tony Abbott said in his speech.
We might move on.